Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Today we are on our second video in this video series explaining the Constitution, and today we're going to be talking about Article 2, which is all about the executive branch. And then we're going to talk about Article 3, which is all about the judicial branch. So, the executive branch of the U.S. government has what's called executive power. This is the power to carry out the laws. The judicial branch has the power to interpret the laws. The legislative branch has the power to make the laws. So the executive power is, I like to use the example of the Federal Marshal Service, where the legislative branch has the power to write the laws. And even after they vote on the laws, write the laws, and that law gets signed by the president, it is still just a law in theory. It is not a law in practice. Executive power would be the power to take a law written by the legislative branch that creates the Marshal Service, and then they put it into actual practical use. They hire the people to be the U.S. Marshals. They build the buildings that the U.S. Marshals are based out of. They buy the uniforms that the Marshals have to wear. They buy the cars. They put the logos on the cars. They're the ones that do all of that decision making that carries the laws into practice. Now, the chief executive in the United States is called the president, and there is only one president as chief executive of the U.S. government. Now, this was a big issue with anti-federalists because giving one person all that power is a lot similar to a monarchy. And it is, but there's a reason why they only gave one person executive power, and that is because executive power requires someone to be able to make quick decisions. After laws are written and are landed on the president's desk for a signature, the time for deliberation is over. So the prevailing argument is, why not have two presidents like they had in ancient Rome? Why not have three? Why not have a council of six? And that's because with 2, 3 people or 6 people, you're going to have multiple viewpoints. You're going to have people who are trying to come to common ground. And once the law's already been voted on by the Congress, the time for deliberation is over. Now we need someone to make a decision on that law. And think of the other powers that the president has. The president also has military power. You don't want 2 or 3 people disagreeing on what the best course of action is when you're talking about making big military decisions. So that's why they only wanted one person in the executive branch. And that's why we only have one president. That one president serves a 4-year term of office, and the vice president is elected at the same time as the president and serves the same term. Historically, it was the quote-unquote loser of the presidential election. It was the second runner-up of the presidential election, but usually this meant that it was someone from the opposite political party trying to work with the president. So that didn't work out too well. They ended up switching that so that the president and the vice president would be elected from the same ticket, and that's how it's still done today. The Electoral College is what actually elects the president. Do we get a popular vote for the president? Yes. Is it actually counted when it comes to deciding who the president's going to be? No, it's not. All right. So the only votes that actually count when you are voting for the president are the Electoral College. The people do not directly vote for the president. The way this actually works is that each state gets a popular vote. And in most states, Illinois works this way, is that the person who wins the majority of votes gets 100% of those electoral votes. So even if the election is split 50-50, the winner of that election in that state gets all of those electoral votes. The fair thing to do would be to split those electoral votes down the middle so that half of them go to one candidate and the other half go to the other candidate, but that's not the way it works. If 51% of the people vote for candidate A, then that means that 100% of the electoral votes in that state go to candidate A. And the electoral votes are the only ones that counted. The reason this is the way that it is, and the reason it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, is because it wasn't originally intended to work this way. The people were not intended to vote on the president at all. Essentially, how it was meant to work is that electors from each state would be chosen by the state legislatures, and the state legislatures would send those electors to Washington, D.C. to cast their votes. The number of electors each state gets is the total number of U.S. senators and representatives from that state. Now, I want to make a very clear point that senators and representatives are not the electors. All right? The electors are a completely different set of people that the state chooses, that the state legislature chooses to go to Washington, D.C. to vote for the presidents. They're the ones that get to cast their votes to vote the president and the vice president into office. And when the Constitution was written, there was no popular vote at all. They sort of added that later, and that's why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because constitutionally we have to have an electoral college, but in spirit of popular sovereignty, rule by the people, we wanted to give the people a voice in who the president was. All right, it's up to Congress to decide when the president is elected, and they decided that that would be the Tuesday after the first Monday in November of every fourth year. This seems a little bit convoluted, but there is a reason for it. They wanted Election Day to be far enough away from payday. In 1787, most people got paid for the previous month on the first of the month, and they didn't want elected officials asking for bribes, so they wanted to separate it from payday a little bit. So that's when General Election Day is, but the electors have a different election day altogether. They cast their ballots on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. So again, they didn't want them accepting bribes, so they put it even further away from the first of the month and had them cast their ballots in December. What are the qualifications to be the president? Well, you have to be a natural born citizen. That means you have to be born in the United States, born in a U.S. territory, or born to United States citizens as parents. You have to be at least 35 years old. There's never been a president that young, but that is the youngest you can be to run for president. And you must have lived in the U.S. for 14 years. They don't want someone who's lived abroad their entire life saying one day, I think I'll move back to the U.S. and run for president. No, you actually have to have lived here. You have to prove that you have had a permanent residence here in the United States for the last 14 years. They want to make sure the person they're electing to run the country knows what's going on in the country. So the president's salary is decided by Congress, and it cannot be raised or lowered during the president's term in office. And the president also cannot receive a salary from any other governmental institution. Why? This is so that Congress can't bribe the president by withholding any money or passing a raise for the president. They can't say, hey, if you sign these bills into law, we're going to raise your pay. Or if you don't sign these bills into law, we're going to take your pay away from you. You can't change the president's salary midterm. You could pass a law that raises the president's salary for the next term, because there's no guarantee that that president's going to be reelected for the next term. All right, you don't have to write this down, but this is always a question I get asked when I go through this, is what is the current salary of the president? As of February 2023, it is about $400,000. The Constitution also establishes an oath of office, so the president must make a public promise to faithfully carry out the duties of the job before he or she, someday there will be a female president, can serve in the office. What are the powers of the president? Well, the president has military power. The president is the commander-in-chief of all of the country's armed forces. The framers wanted there to be a sort of third party commanding the military, so that was the person of the president. Again, they wanted a one-person, decisive, energetic executive making those decisions. The president is also in charge of all of the executive department heads. And so these are things like the Attorney General is in charge of the Justice Department. Well, the Attorney General's boss is the president. The State Department is headed by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's boss is the president. The president actually is the boss's boss's boss of all of the executive departments, like the Department of State, the Justice Department, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security. All work directly under the president. So they are in charge of all of that. They have the power to reprieve and pardon those who have committed federal crimes. As a matter of fact, a funny example of this is President Bill Clinton back in the 90s decided he was going to pardon his brother after serving 1 year in prison for federal cocaine distribution charges. He was 100% guilty, but the president pardoned him anyway because it was his last day in office and he had nothing left to lose. So that's actually a check that the president has on the judicial branch. They have the power to make treaties, but all treaties have to be approved by the Senate. A fun way to work around this is that the president gets the ability to make what's called an executive agreement. So this is essentially a treaty that doesn't need the Senate to approve it, but that executive agreement actually does expire when that president who made it leaves office. President has appointment power too. They make hundreds of appointments every year that they are in office. Presidents appoint ambassadors. They appoint Supreme Court justices whenever there's an opening. They appoint cabinet members. All of these high-ranking appointments need Senate approval. And depending on how high profile the appointment is, the more the Senate calls into question the president's judgment on this. So Supreme Court justice appointments are usually heavily questioned by the Senate. Things like cabinet members, the Senate will typically just kind of fast track and approve no matter what, because they figure, hey, whoever you want working for you is fine. We're not going to sit there and question them for hours and hours and hours. But a Supreme Court justice that's going to serve for life and potentially overturn or uphold the law of the land, we want to make sure that we have competent people. We're going to question them very heavily. Some other duties of the executive branch: they appoint people to various jobs within the State Department. Maybe not as big as cabinet officials, but if it's just a job in the State Department that is appointed, then that doesn't need Senate approval. Not very high profile. They get to fill up vacancies when Senate is in recess. So Senate vacancies are up to the president to fulfill, but the Senate can overturn those or take the presidential appointed senators out when they are back in session. So these are temporary appointments. The president is in charge of letting the country know how the country is doing through the State of the Union address. These days, that is heavily televised. They also can call emergency meetings of Congress if needs be. They're also the ceremonial head of state. They receive foreign ambassadors, foreign emissaries, and they're the ones that go overseas to do official state visits and things like that. The executive branch oversees, or the chief executive oversees everything that goes on in the executive branch. They ensure that the laws that are enacted are properly carried out, that all of the various departments in the executive branch are doing their jobs to the best of their abilities. So they oversee the State Department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Justice, the Department of Agriculture, so on and so forth and such as. And then there's a reminder at the end of Article 2 that says the House can impeach you and the Senate can remove you from office at any time if they disagree with your conduct. You don't necessarily have to break the law in order to be impeached. You just have to do something politically wrong. All right? And remember that to be impeached means you are accused of wrongdoing. All right? The House impeaches, the Senate removes. Here are all the various executive departments that work directly underneath the President of the United States. So you don't have to write all of them down. I would write 3 or 4 of them down so that you know that it's not just one person in the executive branch. There's thousands upon thousands of people in the Department of Defense, the State Department, Department of Health and Human Services, the Treasury Department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Labor, and the Department of Homeland Security. There are 15 executive departments that work directly underneath the president. And that is Article 2. Now let's head into a super short article, Article 3, which is the judicial branch. It might be super short, but it is very important. So please make sure you're still taking notes. So this is all about the judicial branch, and the judicial branch has judicial power, which is the power to decide legal cases and legal questions. The judicial branch is comprised of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts that Congress can set up. The Supreme Court is the only court that the Constitution mandates there must be in the country. Every other court in the federal judicial branch is actually created by Congress. That's a major check that the legislature has over the judicial system, is they have the power to create every single other federal court besides the Supreme Court. And they also have the power to decide how many justices sit on the Supreme Court as well. So if you serve as a federal judge, that is a lifetime appointment. You are a federal judge until you die. So it's not a lightly taken appointment. These are judges who have practiced law for a very long time. They are highly qualified and they are highly passionate enough to want to serve in the department of the judicial branch until they die. Justices' salaries can't be lowered during their terms, but seeing as their terms might last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, they are allowed to be raised during their terms. Federal courts, the sorts of cases that they hear are cases involving the Constitution. That's probably the most important types of cases that they hear, are questions of, is this constitutional or is it not? Think of Roe versus Wade, which was overturned in the summer of 2022. Is the right to an abortion a constitutionally protected right or is it not? A previous Supreme Court actually said that it is a constitutionally protected right. They decided that the 14th Amendment gives everyone a right to privacy and the right to an abortion falls under that. Come to summer 2022 and the Supreme Court overturned that. They said, no, that was a faulty reading of the Constitution. That needs to be overturned. They also hear cases involving the laws of the United States, so laws that are created federally but don't fall into the Constitution. They hear cases involving treaties and treaty violations, any case in which the United States government is a party to that case, so the United States versus Lopez or so-and-so versus the United States. Disputes between citizens of two different states about claims to grants of federal land. Disputes between U.S. citizens and citizens of foreign countries would be heard by the federal judiciary. And here is the Supreme Court of the United States as they are in February of 2023. All right, so the number of justices on the Supreme Court is set at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's usually set at an odd number so that there's less of a chance of there being a tie. There's always going to be a tiebreaker with an odd number. But this is the number that Congress has decided is the perfect number for being on the Supreme Court. They could add justices to the Supreme Court. They could take justices away from the Supreme Court. They could restructure it however they want to. There haven't always been 9 justices. As of February 2023, there are 9 justices. All right, let's talk a little bit about that Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not a trial court, and what that means is that they don't hear the original facts of the case and decide who's guilty and who's innocent or who owes who money. That is what is called original jurisdiction. The Supreme Court has what's called appellate jurisdiction. If you look at the word appellate, it looks kind of like the word appeal. And that's what the Supreme Court hears. They hear appeals of cases that have been heard before. So this is opposed to original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is where a court hears the facts of the case and decides on a verdict or decides who has been wronged and who owes who money, or is there any money even owed at all. Cases have to first go through a lower court, some sort of trial court, a verdict has to be made, and then the loser of that case has to decide that there was a mistake made. If the losing side thinks there was a mistake, then there is what's called an appeal. The loser makes an appeal to a higher court, says, I think they misinterpreted the law. Can you take another look at it? And instead of judging me, can you judge the judge? And so if a case gets to the Supreme Court, they don't judge the people. They don't judge the parties. They judge the previous judges. They judge how the law was applied in that original trial. Was the law applied correctly? Is that law, in fact, a valid law? Or should that law be struck down because it goes against federal law or it goes against the Constitution? That's the Supreme Court's job, pretty much in a nutshell. They get to choose which appeals to read and call up and decide on. They are supremely busy. They have thousands of cases appealed to them every single year. They could not possibly read all of them. If 4 justices agree to hear a case, then it gets heard and it gets decided upon. All right, but it's up to the justices to decide which cases they want to even hear in the first place. There are other federal courts besides the Supreme Court in the judicial branch. They're lower than the Supreme Court, but they're still above your regular like state courts, and they're still a part of the federal judiciary as well. You don't have to screenshot this or write this down. It's just, it interests some people to know how a case gets to the Supreme Court. So if you look over here on the left-hand side, it could either start in federal court. So it could go to a federal trial court called a district court and then get appealed if they think there's a mistake to a U.S. Federal Court of Appeals. And then from there, it would be appealed up to the Supreme Court because that's the next highest level. A state trial or a local trial could actually get appealed to the Supreme Court, and that has happened in history, but it would start at a local trial court, and then if there was an appeal, it would go to a state appeals court, then it would go to the highest state court of appeals, which would be the state Supreme Court, and then it could either get appealed to a federal appeals court, or it could get appealed directly from a state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then interestingly, if anything starts in a special federal court, like the Court of International Trade, the Court of Claims, or the Court of Military Appeals, then if that case gets appealed, it automatically goes directly to the Supreme Court. All right, some miscellaneous items in the judicial branch. They talk about what happens if you're accused of committing a crime against the United States. And if that happens, then you automatically have the right to a trial by jury in the state where that crime was committed. The exception to that rule is impeachment trials, because impeachment trials are not criminal trials. They are political trials. And if you are a federal public official and you get impeached, then your jury is automatically the United States Senate. They also talk about what is considered treason. They wanted to lay that out pretty succinctly. So you're guilty of treason if you are convicted of waging and carrying on war against the U.S., or if you're convicted of helping the enemies of the U.S. They don't make it easy to convict someone of treason. You have to have 2 witnesses testify to the fact that you are indeed guilty of treason. And Congress gets to decide the punishment for treason, but the only caveat is that they can't take something away from the wrongdoer that would then punish the wrongdoer's family. So they can't take property away. Usually it's something like lifetime imprisonment or something like that. And that wraps up the judicial branch. So make sure you've got plenty of good notes taken, and we will see you in the next video.